book for Jenny, which was understandable. For some time, Jenny was also a tour guide at the Flinders Street station, a walking tour guide. And I don't think she does that now, but maybe if there's enough interest here, she might do a special tour for us. In summary, Jenny's had a long and publicly recognised passion for the Flinders Street station, and I'm sure we all share that to a degree, because Flinders Street station is one of those buildings, and I think we all tend to think we own it. It's just there, and we all have some affiliation with it. We're always using it and get to know it, and it is a very nice looking building. So maybe that's another reason why there's so many people inside the moment. So it's my great pleasure then to introduce to you Jenny Davies. Jenny, would you like to come forward? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me here. It's a great pleasure. I've tended to speak to Probus groups, which of course there's thousands of, and it's getting to the stage now where it's a third or fourth hand, you know, Jenny's a good speaker, what do you talk about? And I decided, no, I'm not going to that Probus group, I haven't got time. But I've probably done about 190 talks over the last few years since I published my book, so I've been out and about around Melbourne and down to Mornington Peninsula and Phillip Island and all over the place. So I've certainly had a lot of input and additional stories told to me over that time. The story about my grandparents is in fact true, but it's not quite as romantic as you might expect. I was doing my family history in the State Library, and I was getting pretty bored and you know, couldn't find anything else much about them, and I had this vague memory that my grandmother had said she'd met my grandfather at a dance at the station. Well, I don't come from a railway family. In fact, I've never used trains very much at all, because we lived out in North Bourne, so we either caught the tram or we used the car, which is still the case. And so this whole thing about the railways and the railway station and the ballroom was all great excitement. I had no reason to doubt that there was in fact a ballroom there. But the notion of my grandmother, who was of East Prussian descent and 6'2", very hefty lady, telling me that she saw this sad little man sitting on the side all on his own, and he was 5'6", an ex-AIF, probably still shell-shocked, and she made him get up and dance with her. So it wasn't that romantic, but it would seem that she also made him marry her. But he wasn't alive for me to ask him the validity of that, but they were certainly an odd couple. Anyway, while I was thinking that I'd come to a total dead end about the research and family history, I thought, oh, I think I'll go down to the station and have a look around. And of course I was greeted by the IW student, we haven't done tours through this building for years, you won't get in a fit. I thought, I'm pretty good at this. I thought, right, there must be a station master. And in 1999, indeed, there were people who were still called station masters, and I found one. And I told him the story, and he looked at me, and I thought, uh-oh, I've done my dash. But he jiggled his keys and told me to come with him. And he gave me about a 40-minute tour of the upper levels of the station, and told me a lot of stories about the history, particularly of the Railways Institute. And I suppose because all of this was so new to me, I was absolutely agog at how much I didn't know about the most recognisable building in Melbourne. We ended up on the roof of the station on a very sunny, clear October day, behind the dome, so best vantage point on the roof, and I looked across the station and the yards and across the yard, and I thought, this is really bizarre that no one has written anything about this station. And I had this kind of flash that maybe I could do it. Anyway, I continued with some research, particularly about the Railways Institute, and there was quite a lot of journals in the State Library, which I spent 3 or 4 months looking through every page and photocopying anything to do with social history. I wasn't interested in that stage in tracks and trains. I thought that's way out of my depth. But people, that's more my thing. And I was particularly interested in what gave people a sense of place in relation to buildings. The man who was in charge of the photocopying room at that stage turned out to be an ex-high-ranking VR driver. So I spent more months in the photocopying room than anywhere else, talking to him about all the things that I had discovered. Now, he had driven just about every loco in Victoria, and his father was a driver of the famous Heavy Harry. So Russell was full of stories, and that just reinforced my belief that there must be millions and millions and millions of stories out there that have never been recorded. So once again I thought, how strange it is that there's not a book about, for instance, the architecture of the station, and in many architectural books on Melbourne it doesn't even crack a mention, which is even more bizarre. It wasn't certainly the largest project that was going on in the early 1900s, and the newspapers of the day were fairly circumspect about making any comments about it, which I thought was a bit strange, until I discovered that one of the previous Chief Commissioners had sued David Symes of The Age because of what The Age had said about his overspending on the Maryborough station. So I think they were all going a bit quiet. That's the only reason I could find that there wasn't more celebration of this magnificent building that was happening in the busiest intersection in Melbourne. Anyway, having spent months and months and months chatting to Russell and photocopying pages, you know, life moved on and I didn't have a chance to follow it up. And it was also a case of needing to know who my target audience was, although there isn't anyone who doesn't know where Flinders Station is, and there isn't anyone who hasn't been there, who's been in Melbourne for more than 10 minutes. And so obviously the target market could have been anybody, but I didn't have a theme that I felt could bind together the very diverse number of stories, including the architectural history. So the idea sat there for quite some time, until in 2003, some friends of mine asked me, have you got a project in mind that you think you might pursue? And it was a bit of a game, you know, like tell us a secret. And I started talking about the station with such passion that they looked at me, and after about 10 minutes when I finally stopped, they said, well, you better get started if the centenary is in 2010. And I thought, oh, I better get started. So the next day I started, and I found, in fact, a mind map I'd done the very next morning, and I'd written on it all the little bits and pieces that I knew about the station and some of the connections and groups and so on that had been involved, and of course some information about the fact that it is our central railway station, so a huge amount of the history has to do with the railways. But there was all this other stuff that had to do with people, and in the middle circle that bound all this, I'd written meeting people's needs. And so I found that everything that I had researched to date could be traced back to that. And what I did then was write the book with that in mind. There was a number of consultants' reports done by Peter Lovell, and his reference list was fabulous. So I retraced all his references and found out a lot of information. But one of the most delightful things was actually collecting anecdotal stories. I decided that there were still enough people around who had been intrinsically involved in both activities at the VRI, the endless dances that were there, and the other activities such as the commercial activities on the concourse, which no longer exists, and the shops along Swanson Street, Elizabeth Street, sorry, of course, the famous City Hatters and Hearn's Hobbies, which are also been with us for a long time. So I was sitting up in my study at Mount Macedon, which is a nice place to write because when you get bored you just look out the window and that's all rather beautiful. And I thought, oh, I've come to a dead end about the story of the Hearns. Now I knew that they had been highly recognised in aeromodelling magazines and in that field of interest, but they weren't mentioned in any general books. So I thought, oh, there must be some Hearns in the phone book, I think I'll ring them up. So this was before I thought of Googling them through the white pages, but anyway, the phone book was interesting because I rang the first Hearn and I knew what the boys' names had been, Jack, Keith and Bruce, so there was a B Hearn. The person that answered the phone firstly had to get over the challenge of not sounding like a telemarketer, so that was interesting, and I don't think I'd get away with it now, but the person on the other end of the phone said, "That's not our branch of the family, but we know who you mean, good luck." And so I didn't get the response that I would probably get now if I made random phone calls to people in the phone book. So eventually I got on to branches of the family that were involved in the Hearns Hobby Shop, which actually started in Banana Alley in 1946, and the three boys had come home from the war with the intention of starting an aeromodelling shop. They couldn't find anywhere to lease, and lo and behold, their father lived opposite the Chief Commissioner in Canterbury Road, and he said, "Oh, I've got somewhere for your boys. I'll put them in the Banana Alley vaults," and that's in fact where they started. So I met quite a lot of the Hearn family, and a couple of them wrote stories for me, and I included people's stories in my book as anecdotal story, so that you could actually just turn to the stories and read them without having to sift through the text, and they're identified by having a grey background, so it's quite easy to tell. It's always very interesting with history because it kind of depends on where you're sitting in the room as to what your view of the events have been. And one of my very favourite stories came about, strangely enough, through another incident at the State Library where I was waiting for photocopies and things, and the lady behind me said she only had 2 pages, so I let her go first. But between each of the pages she photocopied, she talked for 10 minutes about what she was doing, and I thought, oh, I'm going to miss the train. Anyway, she finally asked me what I was doing, and it was my turn to photocopy, and I said, I'm researching the activities of the Flinders Street station, and she said, my neighbour's mother was a mothercraft nurse there, and I went, Yahoo! I haven't been, if I've missed the train, too bad. This has certainly been worth waiting for. Now, I met the neighbour, who was the son, and then I met the woman who'd been the mothercraft nurse. Now, Mavis Claw at that stage was about 93 and as sharp as a tack, and she sat there in her chair in a very arthritic state, but highly alert, and she basically walked me through the building, and she could tell me that you had to turn left when you got out of the lift, and then on the right there was the hooks where the kiddies hung their coats, and then there was the matron's office, and all of that kind of detail, which I hadn't yet seen a floor plan of the nursery. Now, the nursery opened in 1933 as an initiative of the Chief Commissioner that I believe was the most inspirational person that's almost ever existed in Victoria. That's a big claim, Harold Platt. And the nursery was designed for children of any family, not railway workers, and probably railway workers couldn't afford it. But Mavis Claw could tell me the names of the other nurses and could even recognise some of the children in the photographs. Now, Mavis's story ended up being a couple of pages long, and despite the fact that the nursery closed in January 1942 when the Japanese air raid precautions came into effect. Mavis said that was bunkum. She said the nursery closed because the matron who'd replaced the original matron said she just didn't have what it took. She had no business sense and that's why it closed. Now to her dying day, which was only last year, that was her truth on the reality of why the nursery closed. So those kind of stories, it wasn't my role to debunk their view of reality. It was fascinating how different and varied stories are from the same place. Now, the centenary of the station was indeed in 2010, and I tried very hard to get the government of the day to celebrate it, but I was met with a huge amount of indifference, and I could tell you a very funny story about the bureaucrats and what they said, but that would take another hour. So I celebrated to do my own way. I'd already published my book. I'd got a little bit of funding from Connex at the time, and we launched it on the second floor of the station building. And I'd invited all my storytellers along, so that was really good fun because most of them I hadn't met before. And then, of course, Connex were phasing out, and I thought, Metro aren't really listening either. I'd sent my son down to give the new corporate affairs manager a free book, hoping to woo her, but I don't think he's had much to do with her since. And then I managed to extract some money out of them to do a launch of a hardcover book, which I did in Federation Square. We expected Metro to turn up, but in fact, Bryn and I were looking at each other about 10 minutes before the event thinking, I think we're going to have to launch it ourselves. So in fact, Bryn launched it for me. But that was fun because we ran a series of old photographs on the big screen, and at some stage I hope that we can do that again because the contrast between the old and the new apparently was brilliant, but we were actually in the atrium so we couldn't see the big screen. So just retracing a bit, as I said, the anecdotal story and the numbers of people I met as a result of the research on this book was extraordinary. Now, given that the Victorian Railways were the biggest employee in the state for many, many decades, it's not surprising how many people are somehow connected with that station or with the railway system. Melbourne, in fact, had the first steam-driven passenger service in Australia, and that left the bottom of Elizabeth Street in 1854, and it just went straight down to Port Melbourne. It was a private company, and the other stations originated through private enterprise as well, which is why we ended up with 3 stations and quite a lot of chaos. The government of the day decided in the early 1860s they better step in and try and make some sense of it, because obviously railways were something that were needed in Victoria. Towards the end of the 1800s, while various parts of the government and the standing committee, Parliamentary Standing Committee for Railways and the Railways Department were arguing about where in fact to put a new station, and in fact what size, design and so on. Those arguments of course go on for at least 20 years with bureaucrats, and it came to a head, and finally they said, we'll hold a competition. Now we can testify to the results of some competitions which have not gone as well as they may have, and I'm doing my best to keep the bureaucrats involved in this one on the straight and narrow, and they're not quite sure what to do with me because I don't work for anyone but myself. So I've chosen to stay independent and stay an independent voice, but I have made it quite clear to them that I could start a major protest in the street by writing to all the groups that have offered to support the refurbishment of the station. One of the best examples was speaking at Melbourne Legacy, and of course they're all retired military people. And at the end, 3 gentlemen marched up to me and said, "Right, we need an action plan." And I said to them, I'm not into petitions or blog sites or anything like that, but I'll let you know when there's some action that may require public pressure. Now, Tip Bailey is well aware of the number of people I've spoken to, so the day may come very shortly where I'll have to get out the address list for those 190 groups I've spoken to. Anyway, the results of the competition were won by 2 railway employees, and one was the architect James Fawcett and the other one was engineer HPC Ashworth. No one ever calls him by his first names because it's too long, but Ashworth was an engineer and Fawcett was, of course, the architect, and Fawcett went on to be the leading architect in the railways. The interesting thing, of course, was that the building that was contracted for 5 years after the competition bore little resemblance to the winning drawings. Yes, my able assistant. This is in fact the elevation along Elizabeth Street that was signed off by the builder in September of 1905, and that in fact is pretty well as it was built. The Flinders Street. Oh, sorry, Flinders Street. Good work. Thank you. Even the signing off of the contract was delayed because the railways were still making changes to the building, and it was tendered for in May of 1905 and finally signed off in September by the builder, Peter Roger. Now, Peter Roger was one of many, many skilled professionals that we had in the state at the time. People always assume that we had to import engineers or builders, architects and so on at that time, but in fact everything that I've found out about Flinders Street is so very Melbourne, and I've investigated a lot more detail in terms of building materials and people involved since I wrote the book and followed their family histories. So I know exactly where Peter Roger lived. I've met members of his family. Items that they hold in family history include his bank book from the time of building the station, and a scrapbook of his is in the State Library, where he kept any article that mentioned his name or any of the buildings that he'd done in Australia, which was very significant, like the Hobart Post Office and the Brisbane Cathedral. So we had that expertise in the state in 1900. And I'm very keen to promote the fact that these people were Melburnians that were involved in this station, and of course the tradesmen were locals. They all lived near train lines, of course. The 350 bricklayers that were on site at one stage, the many, many plasterers, the stonemasons. The chief stonemason was pulled out of retirement in order to undertake the task of supervising the hand cutting of all the stone that was required for the entire building, which had to be done before construction even started. Now, the amount of granite and bluestone, particularly along the first or the ground floor of that building, is very impressive, and I invite you to avoid the pedestrians and have a good look at how much stone there really is there, and the fact that it was all cut by hand and it had to be cut on site. Now, the site itself is very narrow. The building is only about 4 metres in width for most of its length, a bit wider at the ballroom end and wider, of course, at the dome end, which is almost a square with an oblique cut-off to make the entrance that goes into the intersection. The papers reported that not much progress had been made in the first year, but they obviously hadn't looked over the fence to see how much stone had been cut. But once again, they were going fairly warily about any comment or criticism of the process. Peter Roger, in fact, was sacked, and because he was sacked, that left us with a massive amount of additional information that I've since been able to trace. The railways took photographs of the building 2 days after he was sacked, because it must have been on a Friday, yes, so they didn't come back to work till Monday to take the photographs. And it showed the progress to August 15th of 1908. Now, he'd been working on it then for just less than 3 years, but the contract had said he was to finish it in 2. Now, 2 years was a pretty unrealistic time frame, I'd have to say. Anyway, Peter Roger took them in the end to a Royal Commission, and because of the Royal Commission documents, we have additional information about the actual characters involved in the construction of the site. And of course, they're all traceable around Melbourne as well, and they all have their own histories. The thing that struck me very early on in the piece around the decision about what style and what size to build the station was actually a moment of genius, I think, amongst the railway commissioners, because in the period of growing national pride and working towards nationhood and the fact that Melbourne was going to be the federal capital, the railway commissioners said that Melbourne deserved a building that they could be truly proud of. And if they built something that was just for railway business, it would only need to be about a third the size of what was envisaged, because they already had the headquarters down at Spencer Street, which was the admin section. So when we look at great railway stations of the world, we're often looking at the administration section, and when you get to the platforms and so on, they're not necessarily as grand as the admin parts. Now, the commissioners said, because they were coming under increasing scrutiny about how much money they were intending to spend on this project, they said that the 2/3 that weren't required for railway business could be leased out to non-government departments and other tenants, and therefore offset the cost of the building. Now, this was widely applauded, and in fact, in the first couple of years, I read the figures, the rental income equaled the interest to the bank. And that's a bit hard to imagine these days, isn't it? Because they weren't exorbitant rents. But the fact that the station was always built with the intention of being a public building is something that I've really stressed. It wasn't just coincidental that there were tenants there who were accountants, there were dance teachers, there were travel agencies, there are a whole myriad of diverse businesses. It was the intention of the railways, and it is because of that intention that the building had the vibrancy that it had. And I believe that that vibrancy can be returned to that building, that it can be returned to public use. It doesn't have to turn into a boutique hotel or a shopping centre or something really dull like that. The more research I do and the more I speak, the more I emphasise how much it is a public building and how much it belongs to the people of Melbourne. And there is so much of people's family history that is alive and well, that is connected to that space. So I've been keeping a pretty close tab on the competition that's been designed at the moment, and we'll wait to see when it's launched. But I continue to remain an independent voice. I thought at one stage I might get on the judging panel, but I thought, oh, I don't think I could stand that. At any opportunity you have to make a comment, whether it be your local paper or radio or whatever, I encourage you to say your bit about it, returning it to the public, because that was its intention. And of course the Railways Institute occupied the 3rd floor, and the 3rd floor was built solely for the Institute, because the award-winning design only had 2 floors, and they decided to build a 3rd floor even after the foundations had been dug and done and finished, which was a good testament to the engineer who did the foundation work. So I thank you for listening, and I could talk for hours, as my son well knows. Thank you.
So, customary questions, like there's many of them, Barbara? Sorry,
sorry, my voice is gone at this moment. What do you think could reasonably be done to redeem and make practicable the ballroom in particular?
Oh, well, there's no shortage of people who like to dance for a start, of all generations. I think the ballroom, the funny thing was that the ballroom was never designed as such, because in 1904, when the commissioners suggested an institute, they didn't imagine railway men dancing around in there. It was designed as a lecture hall where they would listen to serious topics and become, you know, more learned. So it really didn't become named a ballroom to the 30s. So it's been used for just about everything you could possibly imagine over the time, and there's certainly been no shortage of use for the same number of things again. But there are so many fabulous spaces in that building. The ballroom tends to dominate, but the whole building is quite extraordinary.
Well, I thought along to a museum or even a College of the Arts using it for dance, including performances.
Yes, well, that's certainly possible. I'd ideally like to see a museum, because we actually don't have a viable railway museum, but it doesn't have to be in the ballroom space. There's lots of other spaces where it could be, and so it's that kind of thing that I'll put on my website when I finally get around to it.
Around the room, so
yeah.
one each table, and we'll come back and pick everyone up. Back here, please. Oh, sorry, I'll move around the tables and come back. Give her. Yes.
What is this rumour that Flinders Street was supposed to be Bombay Station and vice versa?
Well, my answer now is fairly blunt. I say I don't know of any public building that was ever built in the wrong spot, because they're also site specific. But I think what happened was when the Bombay Station opened in the 1880s, late 1880s, and it was very Gothic in style, like our ANZ Bank. It was gorgeous. It would have appeared in newspapers of the day, and at that time there was lots and lots of drawings floating around about possible stations for Spencer Street and Flinders. And the myth itself is fascinating, because 80, 90-year-old people have told me that they've grown up with that myth.
Darren?
As a boy, I was dumped by my mother when she went shopping in the creche, or you call nursery, and I was very much deterred that the youngsters, I recall, by the militaristic style of the matron. I enjoyed the railway view. Later on, I was working in the government department in the building, and the conditions there certainly needed a great deal of upgrading. It was pretty overwhelmingly old and bleak then, but I hope it's restored to a nice, workable environment for the future.
Well, funnily enough, the most beautiful room in the place is under the dome, which has been continually occupied by the railways since 1909, and is currently the public relations of Metro. So, you know, people go and visit Metro, get a bit of a distorted view. But I did think about what had caused the decline, and I've come to the conclusion that it's consistent with the withdrawal of money from the railway infrastructure in general, which happened in the post-war era. And the station is just another example of part of the railway system that was not maintained. So it wasn't any great conspiracy, but women tell me that they had glorious times dancing, and they go off and they're all starry-eyed, and I say, well, what was the paintwork like? And they go, I don't know what the paintwork was like. I don't care about that. I said, when you went into the ladies' waiting room, what was the paintwork like? They said, oh, it was a bit, you know, dowdy. I said, well, it was a bit dowdy 40 years ago. It's even more dowdy now because it hasn't had a coat of paint since maybe 1950 or 60. So, you know, lack of cyclic maintenance will do that.
Irene, please.
I love the facade, but I don't love much else about Flinders Street Station. So I'm not quite sure where I sit in terms of wanting it all preserved. But I have read in the Bruce McBride book, Marvellous Melbourne and Me, and he talks about Flinders Street Station in there, that the upstairs rooms did not have a corridor that joined them, and in fact they just had windows, and the windows had to be converted to doors, and the corridor that joins the rooms in fact was built on stilts. It was a very lightweight structure, and there was no brickwork. The brickwork was sort of painted on. Is that fact of fiction?
Part of that is true. The corridor on all 3 levels is cantilevered because the original design had a roof that went right across to the Yarra platform, and the commissioners did away with the roof after the foundations had been done. So they still had to put the corridor in, which was cantilevered, but they had to make it as lightweight as possible, and they did that by putting zinc cladding inside the corridors as well as outside. But they used a lot of railway track in that building, extraordinary amount of track, which is not surprising, also helped the fireproofing of it. A woman a few months ago whose father had been station master there said that the thing that looks like big housing bricks on the south facade were actually made by the Weigh and Works guys down at Newport out of kerosene tins. That's the kind of story I love, and I looked at the size of them and I asked my old apprentices and they said, yeah, that's right, that's what size they were. So it always had a corridor. It just was intended to have a half wall, and people walking along that corridor then would be looking out. Yeah.
Any questions on this side of the room? Sue, was it? Yes?
I don't know whether this is a very great moment or interest, but in 1939 my mother had been badly smashed up in a car accident in Sydney, was in Melbourne after spending 12 months in a hospital. And she used to like to take me into town, I was only little, and a friend said, well look, you can leave Sue at the crate at the Street Station. And she was perfectly right there, and you can come and have lunch at my beautiful hall with me. So she did that, and I spent some time at the creche in the street, wept copiously the entire time. And was shown over by a very nice little boy who kept on saying, look at that train running up and down the lines and so forth. I've hated Thomas the Tank Engine.
Well, I've had people tell me they either loved it or hated it being in the creche and that they cried the whole time. Well, I know from leaving my children in creches, they cry for about as long as it takes you to get out of the door, and they have a fabulous time. They cry when they see you come back, so it's hard to know about childhood memories. But it was certainly very successful, and it ran at a profit, which was very commendable.
And Mark, yes?
Oh, no, that was my memory too, which so many people have mentioned. But I was born in the year 12 and I can remember being, and I loved it, being in the creche. My mother lived over to his Atkinson. Aha. And you could look down and see all these trains. I thought it was fabulous.
Yes, there's a lot of people who remember that even if they'd only been to the creche once. It was had such an impact.
Never got to that.
And of course, the City Hatters that I didn't talk about has always been a hat shop. And if you go down there now, they've still got their original fittings and fixtures. But the first hatter was a man named Douglas Bozzoli, and I've entered into his family history too, which is fascinating. So it kind of goes on and on in meeting people who are connected to commercial retail ventures, as well as things like famous dance teacher Dorothy Gladstone, which many people remember coming out to schools, private schools, PLC, Wesley and so on, and teaching them dance for the debutantes, and they called her Gladstone Bag. She was pretty awesome.
John here, and then one over this side. I'll ask John first.
You're obviously very passionate about the building. I think most people are. How would you envisage the vast expense which would be required to renovate it? Where would it come from?
Well, it's an interesting thing. I was talking to someone before we started about, public donation. I think there'd be lots of people that'd be more than happy to donate to the restoration of some parts of that building, and the fact that there could be some benefit given to them. I had this argument with a man I called the fob-off man. He was the assistant to the Secretary of Railways, and he said, it'll cost at least 10 times more than anyone's quoted. And I said, well, it'll cost as much as the government wanted to, which point he really wanted me to leave. But I said, you didn't have any trouble finding money to restore the exhibition buildings. He said, oh yeah, but that got more use. And I said, I was about to say, excuse me, you haven't been listening. But I did have to remind him that it is our central railway station, and that it is in a state of decline even in the parts that Metro use, and that they're not very happy about the state of it. So something has to be done, and things can cost as much as they like with government contracts, I decided, so we need to keep our eyes and ears alert for those kind of contracts.
What about a raffle?
Well, I rather thought, when the spire was built on the concert hall, that was public donation, and they had the little gauge on the front of the building. I think Melburnians would be more than happy to donate money, and especially older people who have such a strong collection and a strong connection, but also some very interesting things that they've taken home for safekeeping. So they need to come back in some kind of museum as well, because those people are now saying to me, what can we do with them? I like full dinner sets from the Mount Buffalo Chalet and stuff like that. And I said, oh, look, just you wait, I'll see where we can find a space for that.
Last question, please.
I remember in the mid to late 60s, when I was president of a state organisation, that we had regularly rented a meeting room on the second floor, and I can remember going through very narrow corridors, almost like plywood in some places to get through, and it was horribly cheap chairs and very dingy, but we had it regularly rented, and there used to be a little car park around in Flinders Street that was quite cheap, and people came from all over. And surely there are going to be enough rooms to be able to do something like that, to keep the continuity of different organisations.
Yeah, well, I think just about every organisation in Melbourne met at a room in Flinders Street Station at one stage, and a lot of them are a bit unclear as to where the rooms were, and some of the rooms they met were actually on the roof, and you had to go through a tiny little staircase in the dark, and it was interesting walking up there with Mr. Bailey in the pre-election walkthrough I did with him, because all his minders got very concerned he might trip up because it was dark, so they all opened their mobile phones. I thought, oh, surely the man can walk up the stairs. Anyway, it was pretty funny.
Are we going to get a graduate union ginger group?
Yes, well, it's my turn to talk again. When I do my introductions for you, I try and give you something that's different to what's in the flyer that you've seen. I think it's rather than just repetition. And I work on the internet, or maybe visit a library or something to sort of find some information which I've done this occasion. But that's the easy part. The difficult part is always thanking someone, because you really have to sort of think on your run while you're listening to them and sort of say, now what do I say in the way of thank you? And unfortunately this time you've upset me. Because I was taking too much time of enjoying your talk rather than sort of thinking ahead. So I'm not quite as well prepared, but it probably doesn't need very much further summary from me, because I think you've left a very good impression on all of us here, and as I said in my introduction, I refer to it as our railway station. I think you can pick up that from the feeling here too, that we all have a great affinity for the railway station and its future. And as John said, I'm sure there's probably opportunity for having a public appeal and generating funds if our politicians have the purse strings closed. We certainly thank you very much for coming along today. It's been a great presentation, and as I said earlier, you do have a passion for the subject, and it's interesting, as you found here, that wherever you go, you pick up many other little anecdotes and stories, so it's a two-way deal, isn't it? So we have a... we have the customary Graduate House special pen here, and we hope that your next book will see much use of this, and you'll carefully look after this until your next book.
I'll sign my next book.
And we also hope that...
I talked to a group of very senior people out at the Old Colonials at Rushall last year, and one lady came up to me at the end, and she was 93, and she said, "That Mr. Bayou, I think he deserves to have his name on that building, because that Mr. Kennett put his name on everything." And she said, "Will you please send an SMS to him to tell him that we think he should have his name on it?" Now, it was just fantastic. So I did actually have Ted Bailey's mobile number. I don't know whether it worked or not, but I sent a message to say that the older generation in general were highly supportive of having him connected with the refurbishment of the station. Thank you.